It's Wednesday evening. You're listening to Mystic Moon Cafe with Wendy Schindler and Travis Short. Every week, we will interview guests that are experts in various fields of the supernatural, paranormal, unexplained, and esoteric. So sit back and let us take you on a journey to educate, enlighten, and entertain as we broaden your horizons. Now, here's your hosts, Wendy Schindler and Travis Short. You're listening to Mystic Moon Cafe. The views and opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of the hosts, the network, or our sponsors. And good evening, everyone. You're listening to Mystic Moon Cafe Radio. That's a mouthful. That's almost as much of a mouthful as I had to say this morning on one of the boards that my guest on my morning show was appointed to. I'm Travis Short, one of the co-hosts, and I have with me Wendy. Wendy Lady.
It's me. Good
That's
evening.
You. Coughing Wendy Lady. Wendy coughing.
You could very well be, yes. I apologize. If so, in advance. Talking seems to aggravate it sometimes, but I've got the essential oils going and the decongestants going, and
it's not that kind of show. You can't talk about essential oils on this show. If I had said that, I
would have shot you down.
The disclaimer would be played again. Yeah. The disclaimer would be played again. Okay, let's do virtual paper, rock, scissors to see who had the worst day. You want to go for it? You want to go?
Nah, because I'm not going to air mine on the air. I'm not going to air mine on the air, let alone anywhere else. Needless to say, it sucked big moss-covered rocks.
Yes, same here. So, most of our regular listeners know that during the day, during my 9-to-5 job, I manage 2 radio stations in Kentucky. And had the wonderful misfortune today of opening an email attachment that infected my computer with ransomware. Every single file on my computer's hard drive and on my flash drive totally encrypted. 18, almost 19 months of clients, commercials, contracts, budgets, proposals, letters, graphics, anything that has been done for a client in the past 19 months is now irreparably gone.
Lovely.
Just shot. So IT took my computer, confiscated it, quarantined it, took it off, escorted it out of the building. Yes, to be stripped clean and reloaded with the items that I need to function. And all of this happening in a building that does not have air right now, and it was 95 degrees today. So, yeah. So, needless to say, I was sweating bullets.
Well, Vincent was laughing at you, so...
Vincent and I normally get along, but not this time.
But I may have to throw him across the room. Yeah.
He and I are not on the same page. That has been my day. I am exhausted. I feel like I've been hit by a train. I am so...
Sorry.
It's okay. I am just so ready to, talk to Nick tonight, hear what's going on with Roswell, and have a great show. Now, before we get him on, who's coming up next week? I never know.
At this point, I haven't pursued it a whole lot, but I believe we'll have Shane Silvers on, the author of, which one's his? It's another, urban fantasy series. It's a really good one, but it's way on out there. Oh, Nate Temple. The Nate Temple.
Yes. You sent me that information on the books and the characters, and there's a group of people that are like fan casting the characters as to who she played. Yes, I've seen that. Yes, I think my daughter's gotten it. I think my daughter's getting into that. So she's big into fan casting and fandom and stuff like that. So. But so that's coming up next. That'll be a good show. We had to reschedule Sunday's show, which was a special Mystic Moon Cafe segment with Dave and Dave.
Yes.
Dave Spinks, and I forgot the other Dave's last name.
David Weatherly.
Weatherly. David Weatherly and David Spinks.
Yeah.
A new documentary film about Mothman. And
Yes.
we were very excited to talk with them. Of course,
Mm-hmm.
Mothman being one of my areas of interest and areas of expertise. So we had to reschedule that for a couple of different reasons. And I think you're working with them on getting a new date and time for
I
that
haven't
particular.
seen anything. I haven't seen anything from them yet, but they're exceptionally busy. I imagine they may want to wait until the documentary is actually out, but
Which
I'm not positive.
Is that this month or next month?
It was supposed to be the early part of this month, but
That's
we're
what I thought.
in the mid part, so it may have gotten held up in production.
That does happen. It took 6 years to finish my Mothman documentary. So.
Well, but we all know you're slow.
This is true, but now listen to this. Here you go.
Okay, I'm listening.
Yes. That is German medicine called Heineken. Actually, it's Dutch medicine. It's going to help me ease the pain of my day.
Yes, I'm turning to Leinenkugel myself.
I wonder if we could get Heineken to underwrite the show and sponsor it. That may work.
We should try.
Well,
or maybe Leinenkugel, since it is a Wisconsin beer.
That's true. You could do that. I don't know if I've connected you with Cyrus Webb or not. Cyrus is a friend and acquaintance of mine down in Brandon, Mississippi. And he has a radio show called Conversations Live, and he has become extremely successful with his show. He does it as an internet. He's on Blog Talk Radio, but he also broadcasts terrestrially on Earthbound Radio, several different stations in Mississippi. He's syndicated. Has a magazine called Conversations Magazine. But he was announcing earlier this week that he has an official drink sponsor for his show, and that's Aquafina Water. They actually have signed on to sponsor his show, where he drinks it so much during the broadcast. So I'm thinking I need to contact Heineken, Stella, Corona, Liberty Creek Wineries, Pinot,
Barefoot. Restless Spirits. We have Restless Spirits down in Northtown, I believe.
I've got Restless Spirits all over the place.
Excuse me. Yucky, stupid sinuses.
I know you got a sinus infection. I've got one bad lung from the bout with pneumonia last year, and with this rain and humidity, I'm like suffocating.
Yeah. Yep. So, yeah.
It was funny. I walked into the radio station yesterday morning. And Carla, my office manager, because I park in the parking lot, which is across the street from the radio station. It's not a long walk, but I walked in and I was breathing. I was like, she's like, "What's wrong with you?" She goes, "Did you walk all the way to work?" I'm like, "No," but with the humidity out there and only one decent lung, it feels like I ran it. So. But anyway,
we have Aquaman.
I am not Aquaman. I am so far from Jason Momoa. It's not funny. I tend to be much more Tony Stark, or
or
I'm more in that vein of superhero character, much more the laundry list of character defects type of character. Not a demigod ruler of an underwater society. That doesn't tend to be me. Oh, but we have a great show tonight. We have one of our favorite guests back on.
Yes.
And it was funny. I was thinking today, we got his newest book in, the Roswell Conspiracy, UFO Conspiracy. And I was reading it, and I'm like, again, another great book by Nick Redfern.
Oh, golly, yeah, yes.
Very interesting take. I'm very excited to interview him and talk about the theories that he posits in this particular book. But it was funny. I was thinking about how I was going to introduce him, and I was like, thinking about it's this, this is another great book, and then I'm just like, I'm brown nosing. It sounds like I'm brown nosing. when I say that, but I decided I'm not brown nosing. I have created a new word.
Oh,
I'm redferning.
you're Redferning. Is it the Redfern fan club?
It should, yes. I'm redferning. It's kind of
Yes.
like it's like fandom. It's like guy,
Yes.
the bromance and the guy crush.
Mhm.
I'm redferning. That's what I'm doing.
I want you to tell him that when
I
he,
will tell him that when we get him on. I will. I think I actually am thinking about going and registering redferning.com and actual whole Twitter handle and stuff like that and creating. I'm going to create a whole Redfern fandom going on.
Okie dokies.
But I'm excited. I'm excited to have him on tonight. We're going to have this book was not what I was expecting in a good way. I mean, I was expecting
Right, same here.
I was expecting a very different take on Roswell because I have been interested in Roswell since the early 1990s.
You have.
The movie The UFO Crash at Roswell came out, and then I started buying up books and watching documentaries and specials and researching, and then the internet came along. Yes, I was researching long before the internet. And then the internet came along; it became so much easier. So.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I think folks are going to be very, very surprised at the content of the book, some of the theories that he posits. In some ways, much more controversial than what has been presented by other researchers in the past. So, I'm anxious to get him on. So, I guess we can do that.
Okay.
We have a song to play. We have a song to play.
Carly should have a song. I don't know if she's
Okay.
listening or not. I just texted her. She wanted me to text her when it was time. So I guess she'll let us know. Carly,
Okay.
are you playing a song for us while you dial in Nick and we get him on? Is this thing on? Well,
Yes.
right, yeah. Are we muted too?
Oh, we're still live. We're live, Wendy. We're live.
We're talking to our imaginary friend Carly.
Yes,
please
go.
do a song while we're doing it.
See, everything is topsy-turvy and backwards tonight.
Yeah.
But this has been my day. Oh, okay.
All right, we're going to listen to Take Me to Church by Milk, Milck. She's a talented young lady.
I love this song. I can't wait to hear her version.
Definitely.
My lover's got humor. She's a giggle at a funeral. Knows everybody's disapproval. I should've worshipped her sooner. If the heavens ever did speak, she's a last true mouthpiece. Every Sunday's getting more bleak. A fresh poison each week. We were born sick, you heard them say it. My church offers no absolutes. She tells me worship in the bedroom. The only heaven I'll be sent to is when I'm not alone with you. I was born sick, but I love it. Day ritual begins. There is no sweeter innocence than our gentle sin. In the madness and soil of that sad earthly sea, only then I am human, only then I am clean. My lover's got humor. She's a giggle at a funeral. Knows everybody's disapproval. I should've worshipped her sooner. If the heavens ever did speak, she's a last true mouthpiece. Every Sunday's getting more bleak. A fresh poison each week. We were born sick, you heard them say it. My church offers no absolutes. She tells me worship in the bedroom. The only heaven I'll be sent to is when I'm not alone with you. I was born sick, but I love it. Amen.
Okay, you keep trying and I'll keep talking.
Okay.
Hey, we're back with you here on Mystic Moon Cafe. We're having a slight technical problem, which seems to be the way that my day is going. This is
mine as well. Mm-hmm.
Yes, this is a problem. We are attempting to get Nick Redfern on the phone. There seems to be a problem. Technical problem actually seems to be on his end with his phone. So we are we're working on that behind the scenes, trying to get him connected to the program. We apologize. But then, like I said, this has been the way that it's been going. I had technical problems on my show this morning, and then, of course, had problems with the entire computer network there at the radio station today. So we do apologize, but we are still attempting to get Nick on the phone, and if something happens, then we will just reschedule this show. Oh, I think we... Hey, Nick. Nick.
Yes.
How are you, sir?
I'm good, thanks.
Good. It's good to be talking with you on the air finally.
Well,
yes.
Yes. We'll put it down to a conspiracy.
It's fine. It is fine. If you only knew the day that has been going on here. That's why I just assumed the problem was on my end. So
No, it wasn't actually.
It usually is on his end.
It is usually on our end. Well, thank you so much for coming back on the show.
Sure.
I'm going to read your intro, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to tell you something that Wendy found extremely amusing. You may not find it amusing. Wendy thought it wasn't. I laughed. I thought it was funny. I think I'm just a genius when it comes to these things. But we have Nick Redfern on with us tonight. Nick is a recurring guest here on Mystic Moon Cafe. Nick is an author of more than 40 books. They include Men in Black, Women in Black, and 365 Days of UFOs. He's appeared on many TV shows, including the BBC's Out of This World, Sci-Fi Channel's Proof Positive, History Channel's Monster Quest, America's Book of Secrets, Ancient Aliens, and UFO Hunters, the National Geographic Channel's Paranatural, and MSNBC's Countdown with Kevin Olbermann. You can contact Nick by going to his personal website, which is nickredfernfordian.blogspot.com. So, Nick, thank you so much for being with us again tonight. Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure, sir. I have to. Now, I'm going to say this on the outset. We're here talking about your new book, which is the Roswell UFO Conspiracy. And Wendy and I received our copies. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, sure.
But this is the comment that I made. I sat down and I was reading it, and as always, I find myself going, "Damn, he's done it again." It's another great work. It's a great book. It's an easy read. But it's packed full of information. And this is the conversation I'm having in my head while I'm reading it, and I'm going, "Damn it, I'm brown nosing." That if I say this on the show, it's going to sound like I'm brown nosing, and then it dawned on me, I'm not. I'm creating a new word. I'm Redferning.
Yes.
I might have to copyright that before we do it first.
We've already talked about that. While we were having trouble getting you on, I've already taken care of that. I'm sorry. I think we could.
Oh, well. I'll live. I'll survive,
Wendy was like, Redferning? I'm like, yeah. I said, you've got the bromance, you've got guy crush, you've got fandom. I said, Redferning. It's every time I read one of your books, I go, damn it.
Every have a T-shirt made with that on or something.
Exactly. No, I am always impressed with every book that I pick up that you have written, and I swear I'm not saying this just because you're on the show. You always find a way to take a topic and a subject that is in the forefront of the unknown, the paranormal, the supernatural, and you always turn it on its head. You always find a way to take a different angle and a fresh perspective. And you've done that with, literally one of the most well-known UFO conspiracy theories in the 20th and 21st century, which is the Roswell UFO crash. And it is just an amazing read. I cannot recommend to our listeners and to those who will be downloading and visiting the websites, I cannot stress enough how they need to get a copy of this book, especially with the anniversary of the crash coming up in July. So it's, honestly, the way that you've done the book is just phenomenal. And Wendy and I both have read it. She's got her questions. I've got mine. We want to talk about it. I don't think there's anybody out there listening who does not know about the events in Roswell, New Mexico in the week of July 8th. Actually, I guess it was the week of July 4th, leading up to July 8th, 1947. But in case there are individuals who do not, can you give a very brief synopsis of of what is supposed to have taken place and kind of what is the foundation of this book.
Yeah. Well, basically what happened in early 1947, something crashed on what at the time was called the Foster Ranch in Lincoln County, New Mexico, which is about a 90-minute drive from the town of Roswell itself. And whatever this object was, the wreckage, the debris, was found by the rancher at the ranch, Mac Brazel. And he wasn't sure what this material was. It was strewn across a distance of about 600 feet. And he spoke to a number of his neighbors, and one of them said, well, you know, maybe it's one of those flying saucers people have been talking about. So it's important to note that the imagery that it was from a flying saucer was actually sort of cemented by the members of the public who got there before the military, who live locally. So that's an important thing. You know, it was actually, whether it was a UFO or not, the important thing is the seed was sown that's what it could have been. So Brazel then contacted the local police. And the reason why Roswell, the town, has become so connected to it, even though it was like an hour and a half drive away, is because it was the nearest military installation which had sort of a solid base where this material could be taken to and flown out of, etc. So the military from Roswell came out, and what we know for sure is that one of the military guys, Major Jesse Marcel, recovered some of this material and took it back to the base. Now, there are rumours that two other military guys from the base, Sheridan Cavett and Bill Rickett, when they were walking around, they found a second site which had one or more bodies at the site, and also possibly a third site where there was the remains of a semi-intact vehicle. And so we had possibly three sites. Now, what makes the story so intriguing is that, you know, the local newspapers printed a press release from the Roswell base saying we've recovered a flying disc. Now, the following day, it was just a weather balloon, nothing to see, go away, you know. And it remained that way until 1970, well, the mid-70s, when Bill Moore, who co-wrote with Charles Berlitz the Roswell incident, and Stan Friedman, really started looking into it again, or with a new, from a new perspective, so to speak. And from that period onwards, Roswell has become sort of the cornerstone of ufology. You know, it's the number one case. It's the sacred cow, as I call it, Saint Roswell. You know, but there, over the years, you know, various other theories have been put forward for what happened at Roswell. And the new book I've got out now, the Roswell UFO Conspiracy, it looks at Roswell from a very, you know, from the perspective that something very weird and sensational happened, something that had to be covered up at all costs, but not from a UFO perspective. What basically happened is that between 2001 and pretty much right up until the time I finished writing the book, when it came out earlier about a month or so ago, I've spoken to quite a few retired elderly military guys and women who said that, yes, something strange happened, yes, it had to be hidden, but it wasn't a UFO. And they told me a very controversial story which involved, very large balloon arrays taking to the skies from military installations in New Mexico, which had on board essentially human test subjects, like guinea pigs, so to speak. And this was in the very early days of rocketry, and there was a great deal of interest and concern with regard to things like high altitude exposure, low gravity, cosmic ray exposure, things like that, radiation exposure, and that some of these experiments went ahead and failed badly. One of them coming crashing down on the Foster Ranch in the summer of '47 with these human test subjects / guinea pigs on board. And the story that I was told was that the huge field of debris was from this massive balloon which lifted the craft high into the sky. The second site was just as the UFO researchers or believers accept. that there was a second site where the craft itself, which was elevated into the sky by the balloon, when this balloon exploded at high level, the craft came crashing down vertically because it was, had significant weight to it. But when the balloon exploded, it showered down like snow, the materials from the balloon. And then, as often happens in like airplane craft crashes, you find sometimes the passengers are thrown out of the aircraft as it explodes, and they find them miles from the actual crash site. And so that's the story that was given to me, and it basically involves, as I said, these gigantic balloons, early tests into rocketry, and the pre-formative years of the space race, and controversial experiments using everything from prisoners to handicapped people in some of these early flights, and then when and in conjunction with using Japanese and German scientists brought over at the end of the Second World War who were working on some of these programs as well, kind of along the lines of the infamous Operation Paperclip, where a lot of Nazi scientists were brought over to the West, like the US and the UK, to prevent them falling into the hands of the Russians, and then they were put to work on rocketry for the West, now the war was over. And so it all kind of ties in with a lot of early post-Second World War human experiments crossed with early flights into the highest levels of the atmosphere possible at that particular time, and then all hidden under the umbrella of a UFO crash.
Now, what you posit in this book flies in the face of traditional ufologists and what they believe about Roswell. Surely you were expecting a little bit of backlash when you did this.
Well, I do, and I did, But, I'm one of these people who, I've got thick skin. If somebody wants to debate, that's fine. If somebody wants to argue, that's fine. If somebody wants a really heated argument, I'll give them one of them as well, And I think from my perspective, I'm not a UFO debunker. I'm not a Roswell debunker. What I am is somebody who is deeply interested in the case and is not looking to uphold belief systems or to say what people want to sell books. I'm saying what I've uncovered, and which I think could well be the answer. But it's not the answer that most people in ufology want to hear. But that's tough. That's how it goes. I'm not going to apologize for the fact that I've uncovered a great deal of incriminating, intriguing, controversial material that pushes the case down another angle, so to speak. But yeah, I think because Roswell has been elevated to, ufology's number one case, then anybody who comes along and questions it and suggests another angle, you are going to get criticized, and you are going to get people criticizing you and sort of attacking you, but I attack back. That's what you got to do.
Exactly. So I want to kind of lay a firm foundation for the direction that the interview will go. So basically, in your book, you present, as Wendy and I talked about this already before the show tonight, but you present an alternative version of what may have happened, and I stress what may have happened because I have said this numerous times in addressing Roswell. We will never know 100% what took place in Roswell, New Mexico.
That is an important thing to note because, even if people agree with me or they don't agree with me, I have been sort of like brutally honest in saying, look, this is a theory, just like all the other theories are theories. If we had 100% facts and evidence of what happened, the three of us wouldn't have this conversation now because everybody would know.
Right.
So, in other words, I think when it comes to Roswell, ufology needs to sort of take a careful look at what we know for sure, because there are certain facts we know for sure.
Right.
And what amounts to theory, what amounts to belief systems, and what may lay sort of vaguely between all of those three areas. But, as people have asked me, do I think is it possible that this is like a layer of disinformation that I was deceived by? Well, I cannot dismiss that.
Mm-hmm.
I would be lying if I said I could 100% dismiss it. I cannot. But in saying that, I've dug as deep as I can without actually seeing the official files. And I think in the book, I make a good, solid case that, yes, something profound happened, but it may not have involved extraterrestrials.
Right. And that's where I was going. Basically, in this book, you take, as we've already stated, one of the most revered incidents in ufology, the supposed UFO crash in Roswell in 1947, and you are stating that may not be the case. It may not have been an unidentified flying object from another world or another dimension or another universe, but it is something, in many ways, I think, much more sinister and much more troubling that if what you posit is the case, then it's much more troubling that our government was involved in that than if they were covering up that there were little gray men visiting us from another world. But you
it's
do
almost
posit
more
that.
believable.
It is. But that is what you present. Now,
Mhm.
my question, having said that as a foundation, and this would be my question, and then I'll let Wendy ask one of hers.
Mhm.
Does by stating that, and I think I know your answer, but I want to ask by positing this theory, do you think that rips away the possibility of extraterrestrials in general? Because this is, I mean, this incident is what most people hold to as some form of believing that there is life out there because of Roswell.
Yeah.
By positing this new theory, are you stripping that away?
Well, I wouldn't say I'm stripping it away, but some people who have read the book and support have come around to supporting the theory, have become disillusioned about the nature of the UFO phenomenon. But the important thing to note is that we should be able to separate Roswell the case from ufology as a phenomenon. In other words, over the years there have been thousands and thousands of UFO cases, sightings and reports. And we know some of them have turned out to be hoaxes or fake photographs, but many stand the test of time, and many, I think, will stand the test of time as genuine unknowns. But the problem is, when you elevate one case to such a level of, uniqueness over all the others, it's the best case, then I do understand why, if it collapses, people would become disillusioned. But they should remember that there is a good body of evidence of UFO sightings. And so the important thing to do is to try and focus on each case as an individual event rather than having Roswell, which defines the subject right now. We shouldn't really have a single case that defines ufology, because it's like that old adage, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. And you have the ripple effect then. So I think the important thing to do is not to put all our eggs in one basket, so to speak, but to look at each case on its own merit. And even if Roswell collapses as a UFO event, that doesn't necessarily mean that, like the Socorro case or the black flying triangles that people talk about, it doesn't mean they're not valid. It just may mean that one case that everybody thought was linked to the UFO subject may not have been,
I think, because you do look at the other things that have transpired post Roswell, Betty and Barney Hill, as you mentioned, the Socorro, the Aztec, New Mexico supposed crash. There are other, the Rendlesham Forest incident there in the UK. So there are these other incidents. So, but I do think, it's, basically, and I'm not being irreverent. Well, I am being irreverent, but not intentionally. But I mean, basically, by taking it, Wendy knows that. That's why we have a disclaimer on this show. By taking Roswell and taking it in this direction, for many people in ufology, it's tantamount to standing in a church on Christmas and disproving the virgin birth and the nativity.
You're right. It is. That's exactly what it is. But again, that's just down to the fact of how ufology has treated Roswell. It's kind of like if a famous UFO photograph collapsed, ufology wouldn't collapse, because nobody would have elevated that case to the number one level, so to speak. So I think that we can learn, if it does collapse, we can learn a big lesson from what can happen when you have when you turn one UFO case into the equivalent of like a rock star, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
And that's the problem. The problem isn't what happened at Roswell. It's because the problem is the fallout of what if we do get the answer. And the problem is caused by people in ufology who insist on making it the case that's going to break it or make it. And if you say it's going to break it or make it, and it goes down that path of breaking it, well, that's what happens when you do that.
Absolutely. But, we've seen this in the paranormal and the supernatural before. You take things, for example, 'cause I know you're interested in cryptids and things like that. The infamous Loch Ness Monster photograph that floated around for years is evidence, and people have come out time and time again saying it was a fake, it wasn't. But that hasn't dissuaded individuals from believing in the Loch Ness Monster or trying to find the Loch Ness Monster. Same thing with the 68 Patterson Bigfoot footage. That doesn't discount the other sightings all over the world just because one particular component of the Fortean research, for lack of better terms, looking into all things unknown, just because one thing or one component, our perspective of that component has changed, doesn't change the overall field of ufology, the supernatural, the paranormal. Quite frankly, we strive to understand the unknowable. But the fact of the matter is, if we could do that, then people like you would be out of work. You would have nothing to write about. People like Wendy and I would have nothing to do as a hobby to interview people like you if we knew everything. So all that you're doing, and again, I love the book. I love and I'm trying to not come across as confrontational. I'm just trying to walk the line as a devil's advocate from the supernatural, the paranormal world. What I think you've done is actually just say, let's look at it with a fresh set of eyes in light of new evidence that is coming out.
Yeah, that's right. And I actually don't mind, a good confrontational, conversation into it can actually be good because I think, number one, the listeners actually like that. And number two, it demonstrates that, you can have sort of a heated debate. And at the end of the day, you should, in theory, you should be able to sort of hang out and have a beer afterwards together, that kind of situation. But unfortunately, that often doesn't happen because emotions take over and belief systems and things like this, and people get very, arms folded about it, and how can you dare to do this? But all I'm doing, is presenting the data that I've uncovered that pushes it down this human experiment angle of the theory. What I'm not doing in the book is calling any UFO researcher who's looked into Roswell as an idiot because they've got it wrong. I would not do that because, number one, some of them are my friends, even though we disagree. But also, they're just doing what I'm doing. We're all looking for the truth of Roswell. So I don't look at this by any means, as a way to poke fun at ufology or, put people in a bad light. It's purely me saying, this is what the guys and the women who I spoke to, these elderly people, told me what really happened, and this is the backup data I've uncovered, that there was, a lot of controversial experimentation going on people back in the late 40s around the world, the US, the UK, Australia, and look at what was going on in New Mexico with all the Japanese and German scientists coming over. And new technology, rocketry, and experiments, lifting, for example, monkeys and pigs into the highest parts of the atmosphere. A lot of really weird stuff went on in New Mexico in that period. So basically, I'm telling the story that what I've uncovered, people can take it or people can leave it. But I would hope if people do read it, they don't read it from the perspective of me debunking it. I'm not debunking Roswell. I'm presenting an alternative theory. And I would hope people would be able to read the book from the perspective of not being sort of belief-driven or assuming that, well, it's got to be extraterrestrial. That is just a theory, like all the theories are. Even the Air Force when they said that the balloon or the wreckage at the ranch was from what was called a mogul balloon, these high-flying spy balloons. Even the Air Force admitted they actually couldn't find any paperwork to support that theory. They just concluded that it was a likelihood it was that balloon.
Right.
But even they said they couldn't find evidence. Even with the crash test dummies, which they said were responsible for the body legends, they said, well, we think they probably were the crash test dummies, but again, we don't actually have any hard proof to show you. It's just our best guesstimate, so to speak,
Well, and that was what I was going to say. One of the things with Roswell is how many times the official story has changed since 1947.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, it was actually announced as a flying disc in the newspapers. But the important thing to remember is that when people think of flying disc, people today, 70 years after Kenneth Arnold's sighting, 70 years after Roswell, we associate something like a flying disc or a flying saucer or a UFO as an alien spacecraft. Now, we have to remember, this is a really important point. When the Roswell event occurred, this was only 10 days after Kenneth Arnold's sighting and the term flying saucer was coined. Right. So in other words, back then, there was no history of UFO sightings, abductions, crop circles, Area 51, UFO landings, contactees. It was just something that just less than 2 weeks before Roswell happened started to hit the newspapers, and people say, well, what are these flying saucers? In other words, in the public mindset back then, because it was just days after Kenneth Arnold's sighting, there was no mindset that flying disc actually meant alien spacecraft. Today it does, because we've got 70 years of history. So in other words, that's an important thing to know when people say, oh, well, they talked about a flying disc. Yes, they did, but that was without 70 years of law, L-O-R-E, that kind of law, to put in the mind of the people that it was extraterrestrial. But you're right that the first explanation was a flying disc. The day after, it was a weather balloon. Then in 1994, after the congressman for New Mexico at the time, Stephen Schiff, pushed for any files on Roswell to be released, all the agencies came back, said, sorry, we've got nothing, apart from the FBI, who found just a couple of pages which didn't really reveal anything new. But the Air Force said, well, we don't think it was a weather balloon after all, because weather balloons were small and this huge field of debris was gigantic. And they said the best thing they could come up with was something called a mogul balloon. As I said, there were these huge spy balloons to spy on Soviet early atomic bomb detonations. And they had these huge balloon trains, as they were called, were like 600 feet long. And so that's why the Air Force concluded it was a mogul balloon. But in their mogul balloon report, which came out in 94, they said, we haven't touched on the issue of bodies because mogul balloons didn't have crews. So they didn't address the bodies. But then 3 years later, in 97, they put another report out saying, well, the body stories actually do have a basis in fact, but they weren't alien bodies. They were crash test dummies used in parachute experiments. So whether you're a believer or a skeptic, and even the mainstream media has took notice of the fact that since the event occurred in 47, there have actually been 4 different explanations from the government, and again, regardless of which angle you come from, that has to be considered significant,
Yeah, I was going to say, when you say that there have been 4 stories, you are talking about 4 official stamp of approval, U.S. government approved stories that have been told. It's coming from a publicity and PR standpoint, like I do. I can just imagine what was going on when this crashed, because that is the one thing that you cannot deny, is that something crashed in Roswell in 1946.
Something was hidden and something was covered up, and there was a great deal of concern, and the military, particularly at Roswell, were running around trying to contain all this. Those are the things we know for sure. We know that the wreckage was found. That's a fact. Everybody, even the debunkers, even the Air Force, admit that something came down. It's not like they deny that nothing came down. But in saying that, then we've got to kind of look at the other angles of the bodies and autopsies and people being silenced and threatened. those are the things that we've got from the witnesses, from testimony or family relatives down the line. So there are certain things, which are facts, which we can prove. Other things which are very intriguing testimony, and we need to sort of put those together, but recognize the differences between the two.
Right, but I can imagine the U.S. Army Air Force at that point, their PR department going, oh well, this is what's crashed, but we'll just tell them it was one of those flying discs, and they tell them that, and then it's like, oh crap, now we just opened up a whole other issue we don't want to have to deal with. So that's when the lies start. That's when you have to start creating all of these different scenarios and these cover-ups and these different press briefings, and then that's why even 50, 60, 70 years later, the government's still saying, yes, something crashed, but it was this, it wasn't that. Well, look here, don't look there, So it's humorous from a PR standpoint. It's almost as humorous as watching the Trump campaign and the Trump administration on a daily basis. It's like watching Sean Spicer come out, just basically playing Russian roulette with the press.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing is about the press release. A lot of people don't realize that whether you think it's like a human experiment or a UFO came down, both sides of the coin argue that this was a nighttime flight. Now, the reason why I was told that these experiments were taking place at night was because these were gigantic balloons and highly reflective, and these experiments were going on in the summer of 47. And there were some cases where these balloons got so hot in the New Mexico summer sky, and because they were like highly reflective, they exploded. I mean, they literally, were destroyed. So they tried to counter that by having nighttime flights. Now, when this event went totally catastrophically wrong high in the sky, and it came down, he was supposed to, return to the takeoff base. But what happened was that, late at night in the skies over New Mexico, you had this big disaster, and it came down on the ranch. Now, from the military's perspective, the worst thing possible happened, namely that the rancher, Matt Brazel, got there because it was his, the ranch he worked. And so he found it before the military got there. And so while the military that launched it was actually looking for it in totally the wrong place, he'd already contacted the sheriff, who then contacted the people at Roswell, and it was the base at the staff at Roswell that put the story out. And then the other guy who launched it, they're like, oh no, they've just found the wreckage that we have been looking for. In other words, the guys at Roswell were out of the loop on the experiment. They weren't part of the experiment. That was undertaken from a different part of New Mexico. But then when the story was put out, it was, well, no, I remember the public's found it, and now they're talking about flying saucers and they've blown the lid of it wide open. And the guys at Roswell were like, well, we didn't know somebody was flying anything around. Nobody told us. So if you look at it from that perspective, it's quite plausible as to why they might have announced, we think we've recovered a flying disc, because the material was quite extraordinary. And nobody had briefed them that these secret experiments were going on,
Absolutely. Now, what I would like to do in this last hour is you've addressed a couple of things, and I really think it kind of lays a very strong foundation for every argument that you make in the book, and that is you refer to Operation Paperclip and the German scientists and the Japanese scientists that our country brought here to keep them out of the hands of the Russians, and that they kind of spearheaded this experimentation using humans. Now, we know that the Nazis were doing that. We know the Japanese scientists were doing that. That is something that not necessarily, and I'm putting that is underlined and in quotation marks, and there's a star beside it, not necessarily proven that we were doing that prior to this point in time. But what I want to do is have you kind of backtrack us a little bit to Operation Paperclip leading up to and then actually kind of talk about what type of experimentations were being done that actually lays or is the bulk of your theory that you posit in your new book.
Well, basically, it does go back to the sort of final stages of the Second World War. Now, what happened, before the war came to an end, when, the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed and the war came to an end, before that, for a year or so, the Japanese had been flying balloons across the Pacific which had bombs attached to them. They're called Fugo balloons, F-U-G-O. And this was a program where literally thousands of Japanese balloons were flown across the Pacific. And what was that? That was somebody's dog, I think.
Someone let the dogs out.
Sorry, those are mine. Those are the children of the night.
But what happened was the Japanese were flying these balloons over, and they were quite simple, but actually potentially quite deadly, in the sense that they were calibrated to sort of cross the Pacific and reach the United States, and they would get lower and lower. When they reached the U.S., when they landed, the bomb itself that was attached to it would explode. Now, fortunately, there are only fatalities in the U.S. on one occasion. All the others either didn't make it across the Pacific or the bomb didn't go off, thankfully. But all of this was hidden now because for morale reasons more than anything else. But the Japanese bragged in the closing weeks and months of the war that they were building these much bigger, sturdier, massive balloons, which would have these craft attached to them, which would essentially be like a kamikaze mission. You know, they have this gigantic balloon flying over the Pacific with this detachable kind of lifting body type craft below, and the kamikaze pilots in them would literally direct them into cities, you know, laden with bombs, etc. But of course, again, thankfully, that didn't happen because the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki put an end to that. And if we move then from Japan to Germany, when the Germans surrendered, the big fear was that if we allowed the German scientists into the hands of the Russians, they would get a kickstart in terms of the field of rocketry, which was becoming, you know, the next big weapon and technology. And there was a big fear that the Russians would become the next big potential threat. So, the Russians and the West, primarily the US and the UK, there was a big grab to try and get hold of these scientists and bring them over to, the US and the UK rather than let them fall into the hands of the Kremlin, which is understandable. So what happened, you had the German scientists brought secretly to New Mexico under this program called Operation Paperclip, which most of the files now have been declassified on that. You can read them online. And a lot of the German rockets, like the V2 rockets, were brought over. And, it sort of led to the early years of the, kick-started the space program almost. And so, in other words, you had the German scientists brought over, and the much lesser known Japanese angle, where not only were the Japanese working on these huge balloons, but they were also working on exposing people to things like high altitudes, low pressure, high pressure, and in some cases, like really, highly controversial experimentation under this group called Unit 731. Now, Unit 731 was sort of, almost like the Japanese equivalent of like, the sort of mad scientists in Germany. Some of them were just evil people. But a lot of when Japan surrendered, a lot of the Unit 731 files and the balloon files were brought over to the United States and the UK, again, to try and boost, our technologies now the war was over. And so what you had in New Mexico was, an array of German scientists with all their advanced technologies, with the rockets and so on. You had the blueprints and the technology for these gigantic balloons that the Japanese were planning on building. And you had the scientists who'd been doing human experimentation work, trying to determine, how people would be affected by flying these massive balloons into the very highest levels of the atmosphere, almost on the fringes of space. And so that was sort of how it began. And then from there, it was a case of essentially taking hold of the technology and the scientists, and then giving them that offer you can't refuse. It's work for us or be prosecuted for war crimes, that kind of thing. And so from there, you had the development of these massive balloons and the understanding from the files how people would be affected and so on. And that's when they first started, flying rockets into the sky, like the V2s and similar ones, with like mice and rats on board, and then sort of monkeys, and then chimpanzees, pigs. And then, according to all the people I interviewed, the line was kind of crossed. We need some human subjects to take part in these missions. No, they wouldn't be flying the craft. They wouldn't be crews in that sense. They would be essentially loaded on board, and, when they returned to the Earth, they would then determine if the people on board had been affected in any way. And so reportedly deals were done with asylums and hospitals and prisons to essentially get people who wouldn't be missed, which of course is a highly controversial scenario, highly controversial. But a number of although none of the Roswell files have surfaced, files have actually surfaced officially through the Freedom of Information Act, which talk about how, particularly with the early research done in the 40s into so-called nuclear-powered aircraft, which was being planned at the time, but it didn't really go too well because the technology wasn't advanced enough. But the atomic energy aircraft programs, their files have been declassified. And one of them actually talks about, could we do a deal with prisoners or prisons where people in there, say, for a life sentence will essentially turn over the sentence if they're willing to take part in some of these experiments. Those files you can now read at the National Archives in Maryland. So, in other words, there is a precedent for that going on. The big question is, how do we prove it in terms of Roswell? But that's basically how it all began, was with the transfer of the Japanese and the German materials to New Mexico, and then the beginnings of the formative years of rocketry, which would have ultimately then, in the late 50s, led into the space race.
Well, I was thinking as you were talking about these deals being done with asylums and prisons. I mean, we've seen one movie version of that with the military, and that was The Dirty Dozen. I mean, that's basically the premise of The Dirty Dozen. They weren't sent into high altitude, but they were given a suicide mission. They were the worst of the worst criminals that were then recruited for a job by the U.S. military in order to have their sentences overturned.
Yeah, I mean, another example, again, in the real world, is that in the early 2000s, a very controversial story surfaced out of Australia. Now, Australia is a massive country, and most of the cities are actually, dotted around the edge of Australia. And because it's so huge and there's a lot of desert area, in the early 50s, the British government asked the Australian government if they could use some of these highly isolated areas, where there's no people around, to test some of the early atomic bombs. And that's what happened. A lot of people don't realise that the British actually exploded a number of atomic bombs on Australia in the early 50s, but they were sort of test bombs, and,
right.
And there was no one living anywhere near because the sheer size of Australia, and as I said, that most of the cities are all sort of around the coast. But this story that surfaced in the early 2000s out of Australia came from a number of retired elderly people who came forward and claimed that when the Brits flew over and their atomic bombs were taken to Australia, one aircraft had a number of British people, physically and mentally handicapped people, taken from asylums and hospitals and taken out to the detonation sites, and some of them were sort of literally placed, sort of a half a mile from the initial, where the blast would be.
Oh my
some
God.
a mile and a half, 2 miles. Some in sort of hastily built wooden houses or huts, and it was all basically to see how people would be affected at different distances from the detonation of the bomb. And these people spoke out and said, we saw them loaded onto the aircraft, and they were like, some of them had clearly genetic abnormalities and, extremely handicapped. But the whole point was they wanted to see how somebody would be affected by radiation from these bomb tests. And so, but how do you get people who aren't going to be missed? So they crossed the line,
right.
and the Brits took these handicapped people over, and if it's true, it demonstrates why, in many respects, if something like that along those lines did happen with Roswell, you can make a really good argument as to how or why that story would be buried at all costs.
Mm-hmm.
Arguably, possibly even more so than a UFO crash, because it is so controversial.
Well, I was going to say exactly that. I mean, it's one thing for the American people to think we might not be in control of our own airspace. That's one issue. It's a totally different and a totally other issue if we find out that our government is using its own people as guinea pigs.
Well, the unfortunate thing is you can find a lot of things like that in the 40s and the 50s. As I said, the Australian angle is a good example. Another one, just a few years ago in the UK, the British government released a number of files concerning a government facility in the south of England called Porton Down. And Porton Down is where the British government tests all its chemical and biological warfare agents and viruses and things like that. And they do a lot of research into those areas. Now, in the early 50s, when LSD was starting to, be studied, and the realization of how it could alter the human mind in various ways, what happened was that the British government actually initiated a program to secretly dose British soldiers with hallucinogenics, not just LSD, but other ones, to see how they would react. And they weren't volunteers. This was sort of done clandestinely, so they would just suddenly start to feel weirded out. And they filmed the guys, stumbling around, laughing in woods, and unable to fight on the battlefield, etc., etc. And some of those people were actually quite remained psychologically disturbed for years afterwards, and had flashbacks years later. So things like this have happened, and of course in the early 1990s, you might remember President Clinton initiated this program to look at, it was called the human experimentation program, to look at potential things that have been done using radiation on people in the 40s to determine the effects of radiation and to what extent unethical experiments might have gone ahead. So things like this do happen. And so, in other words, could it apply to something like Roswell? It could, and the big question is, if it did, then how do we prove it, or even can we prove it, or if these experiments were so controversial, was everything just burned, shredded, and destroyed to, ensure it never surfaced? So,
well, I mean, and that was kind of segues into one of the questions that I was going to ask you. Looking at the personal testimony and the eyewitnesses and the children of Roswell, to use the title of another book, that have lived and some of them still alive, many of them, unfortunately, and this is one of the things that happens when you deal with events like this, many of them are passing away, and so that those eyewitnesses are no longer there. They're not going to be there much longer. But everyone has had stories of what without calling them necessarily the Men in Black, that's what they were. They were intimidating individuals, obviously sent by the government to silence people. Do you think that your theory in this book lends credibility to those? Were these individuals being threatened about what they had seen because what they had seen was so controversial and could be so damning to the U.S. government?
Well, yeah, I think that's a valid point. The idea that if, of course, all of this stems from the fact that had the rancher not got there first, and the military had got there first, we would probably not know anything about it. That's the important thing to note. It was these unforeseen events of the rancher getting up and finding it had come down on his land. He calls the sheriff, they call Roswell. And the story's out, and the Roswell base tells the local press. So, in other words, had that not happened, even if it crashed and the military got there first, nothing would have come out. But then, of course, when the cat was out the bag, and it was in the press, and then the guys at Roswell had to be shut down as well. Don't talk about this anymore. I think that's when some sort of damage control went into place. And, as you point out, the Children of Roswell book, although that presents things from an alien angle, it very skillfully demonstrates how people were threatened, you will not talk about this or else, And so in that sense, it would make sense to ensure that this story never surfaced, was never revealed. Now, of course, if it was a UFO that came down, then all of the data, the files, the wreckage, the bodies, all of this would be preserved because it was unique material. But if you're talking about semi-illegal or highly questionable experiments on people, and which didn't work out too well, and they didn't learn too much from these experiments, I could easily see a situation where somebody said, well, it didn't work too well, the flight crashed, we didn't learn too much about, the exposure to cosmic rays, etc., etc. People are starting to talk, what are we going to do? Let's just destroy everything. They're not going to keep balloon wreckage anyway, there's no point.
Right.
And even the semi-destroyed craft, well, there's no need to keep that. Maybe they would keep the bodies for a while to autopsy them to see how and why, the craft came down and crashed, and also to autopsy them, to determine if there were any sort of alterations, in terms of the oxygen levels in the blood supply, etc., that kind of thing. But after a while, there would be no need to preserve them for years and years because, technology had moved on by then. So I can see a situation where this doesn't help my position, but where everything may have just been destroyed, everything, and all we've got today are the memories. So in other words, if it's a UFO crash, they would have preserved everything. If it's a massively controversial human experiment, it could have been just destroy everything.
Here's a question that is, I may be putting you between a rock and a hard place. You mentioned that the UK did similar types of things in Australia. The U.S. government, obviously based on the theories that you're positing in your book, did that. What do you think that says about our world leaders and our government, that they're willing to do that to their own people?
Well, I think, it's hard to sort of, I guess, to put yourself into the mindset of how and why that would even be allowed to happen. Now, one of the things I did find was that essentially these scientists were brought over, were sort of given free rein to do what they wanted to do. And one of the people I interviewed said that when the military realized the sheer extent of what these Japanese and German scientists were doing who were brought over, then they actually did shut it down because it was a case of really, do what you got to do. We'll just give you the funding. Do what you've got to do, work in secrecy, and give us the results. And so, in other words, the one bit of shining light at the end of this is that actually when the government as an entity realized what was going down, they didn't endorse it. They shut the whole thing down. But it was because, the scientists were given sort of like carte blanche to do this, that it was only when people realized the sheer extent that they'd crossed the line that then it was a case of, no, we cannot endorse this, So that is like, as I said, that is like one sort of, bright light in it, really. It is,
and I think that is an extremely valid point, because, and again, I'm not throwing I think that, did I use this term last week or the week before? I'm not throwing shade at anybody.
Yes,
I did. I said throw shade, which is a totally millennial term, but I work for a top 40 station, so but I'm not throwing shade at the Germans or the Japanese, or anyone.
You can, though, if you want to.
Well, but I don't want to. I'm not throwing shade at them. I'm just pointing out, we do know historically that especially the Nazi scientists really had a kind of a hierarchy of how they viewed human beings, and there were some that were elevated to a level of respect, and there were some that they did not even consider as human beings. So it makes perfect sense that when they came over, they brought that mentality with them. And it also makes sense that, our government was so ready to embrace them, and because let's face it, I mean, the fact of the matter is, the majority of the technological advances that we saw post World War II came because of Operations Paperclip.
And I think it's also important to note, the reason why. Yes, part of it was grabbing the technology, but the other angle was just the deep, legitimate fear that if we didn't grab them, then the Russians sure as hell would,
Right.
And the nightmare scenario that they had in mind was that if we don't grab these German and Japanese scientists that have been doing these, significant, from their perspective, experiments, then the Russians are going to get everything. And before long, they'll have an atomic bomb. They'll be ahead of us in rocketry. And, there was a great fear that there would be a third world war very close after the end of the Second World War. And so it was a case of, it was almost like doing a deal with the devil.
Right.
It's like, we don't want to work with these people. But if we don't work with them, the Russians are just going to march into Germany, at the end of the war, and take them back to Moscow, and we'll never see them again. So that a lot of it came to that. It was like, none of us want to work with a bunch of Nazis, but what's the alternative if, they've got the technology? And what's the alternative? The alternative is you could find yourself, outnumbered in terms of, and outwitted in terms of technology because we let them go. And I'm sure a lot of they're only normal people, in the military. I'm sure a lot of them were quite conflicted about bringing those German scientists over, because it was only, in some cases, literally months after the war ended. We're fighting our lives against, Hitler and all his crazy cronies and whatever, and now we're doing a deal with them. I can well understand why a lot of people probably didn't want this program to go ahead, but when it was laid out to them, maybe they realized that, well, do we really have to do this? And unfortunately, from their perspective, the answer was yes, we've got to do it.
Well, I think it's so funny that you mentioned the deal with the devil, because that was literally what I was going to say was, you have to ask yourself, what price do you pay when you make a deal with the devil? And then the evil that sometimes is still a hell of a lot better than the evil that you don't know. And so we know what we're getting with the Germans and the Japanese scientists, but we sure as hell don't want to figure out what we may be up against if the Russians get them. Yeah,
that would be a nightmarish thing. I mean, you imagine that that could have led, if the Russians thought they were ahead because they got all that technology, that could have led to, say, like a nuclear war in the 50s, and where would we be now? The world would still be pretty much ruined. So.
Exactly. I was going to say, which everyone was preparing for by getting under their desks in school, because that would save you in a nuclear fallout.
That would help a lot.
Helps a whole lot. Yeah.
But it's like warfare can be things happen in war. It's not like in the movies where some actor or whatever, John Wayne gets shot in the shoulder and just keeps fighting. You get hit by in the shoulder by a
round of whatever.
Or whatever. You're going to go down. You're in shock. Bones are broken. It's not like you see it on the TV. And that's kind of like war in general. We see a certain amount of what goes on, but you don't get to see, the graphic imagery of war, even on today's news, really,
And most of us don't want to. We don't want to. We don't want to see that.
And,
we don't.
I mean, for example, I actually have a friend whose grandfather was in the Second World War, and he openly admitted, that there was one occasion when, they were fighting the Germans, and a bunch of their friends had been killed by the Germans, and there were a couple of German guys who, they found them, and they didn't accept their, surrender, and they shot them. Yeah. They were like, they killed all our friends, and it was like, we were angry, and that happens in war. That's war, and
right, yeah.
The higher ups, look the other way because that's what happens sometimes in war. It's not so clear cut as it sometimes presented.
Too much pain, too much emotional pain, just bottle up.
Yeah.
So they let it go.
Yeah. So things are in other words, things are very rarely black and white. As to why things are done and versus why they're not done. And when you have to kind of do these deals, it becomes kind of awkward. It's kind of like the situation with Iran, trying to develop an atomic weapon, etc. And yet we've got to try and negotiate with them. I'm sure a lot of people who just think we shouldn't be negotiating with them, because why do they want that bomb? Are they going to bomb us? That kind of thing.
Exactly.
So,
exactly.
Yeah. So again, it's things aren't behind the scenes, aren't always what they appear to be. So.
No, especially on a scale as large as global politics. It's you really. It's easy for us to sit in our homes, on a Wednesday night talking and say, the government should do this and the government should do that and this is the way it should be done. We don't know. We don't bear that burden. We don't know what should be done.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times it must be a tough decision to do. Or to put this order in place or that order in place, and I'm sure that could have applied to Roswell. Because the point did come, as it did in the space program, where it wasn't enough to send up a chimpanzee, a man had to go into space to see, what the effects would be and so on, and if it was feasible to do it and bring someone back alive. So inevitably, the human angle has to come into it because it's people who are going to be taking part in these missions, really. So, but then, of course, the question is, like I said, how are we going to get a person to actually, agree to go through this program? Well, most people probably didn't want to, do that. So, we've got to look at a different direction. And, but as I said, the one bit of light in it is that, the darkness was sort of done by these scientists, given essentially free rein to do whatever they wanted. But when it became clear what had happened, it's like, okay, they crossed the line, shut it down now. We should not have done that. So it wasn't like they were, rubbing their hands and we got away with it and we're going to do this again. The story I got was that's why a lot of these crash stories come from the late 40s, I was told, was because after that, when they realized the extent that these Germans and Japanese, what they were doing, that it did come to an end. People did have ethics and said, we can't let them keep doing this. This has got to be shut down. So.
Wendy, you're being quiet on me. Jump in, because if you don't, I'm going to take us down a rabbit hole with a question that probably is going to drive listeners and Nick crazy. So jump in, something quick.
All right. Now, in your 2005 book, the Body Snatchers in the Desert, and now as well, were there any government repercussions against you? Have you gotten any of those ominous phone calls at night? And
I haven't.
Oh, shit.
I haven't.
Okay,
no.
good.
But I think when it what I would say about Roswell is that there's nothing about Roswell we can prove, and so in other words, it's not like that any of us in ufology are sitting on 100% proof. If somebody out there is sitting on 100% proof evidence of what happened at Roswell, some elderly guy who 30 years ago gave his daughter 350 pages of files from the original Roswell file. Well, if somebody had that file, they probably could be in a position of danger. But everybody in ufology who's looking into Roswell, yes, we have a lot of testimony, a lot of data, a lot of interviews, etc., but we don't have anything solid. And I think whoever it is that's hiding the truth, and I actually don't think it is the government that's hiding the truth. I think it's almost like a shadow government buried deeply within the real government. I think the government of today and the Air Force of today, probably, I don't view them as the bad guys at all. I think they are today as much in the dark as we are about what happened at Roswell. And that's why I think the Air Force tried to come up with valid explanations for Roswell, but they were sort of shown to be not that valid, But I don't think they were lying. I think they legitimately did their best to find an answer, but couldn't find it. So in other words, I don't think the government, as we understand the term, is hiding the truth of Roswell. What I think is that you have one of these called special access programs, SAPs, where they're buried so deeply and only the smallest number of people needed know the truth. And that may not even include, the presidents and the intelligence community leaders. It could be an offshoot type group that essentially answers to no one but itself. So in other words, if to get back to the question, which is, and as is the case, if nobody in the UFO community has any proof of what happened at Roswell, which we don't have actual proof, right, silencing people serves no purpose, because if you silence people or threaten them now, that tells the researcher, I'm on the right track. But yep, if you have no proof, then there's no reason to threaten people, because whoever's hiding the truth is safe in the knowledge that nobody can prove what they're saying. So it's best for them just to stay quiet,
Very good. And they may all be gone now, too. As we've said, time has marched on, and quite a bit of time has marched on.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say. I mean, it's easy for us in 2017 to point back and say government conspiracy, and everybody in the government is involved in collusion, and they know what's going on. The government of 1947 was a very different government than the government of 2017. A lot of different people. It's gone through numerous transitions, and it's not like they were uploading files and documents to an iCloud back then. You're talking about tangible documents that are easy to destroy, and once they're destroyed, they are gone forever.
Yeah, there's no, no backup.
Right.
There's no flash drive, there's no anything, There's just original files which could have been kept or could not have been kept. But as I said, it doesn't help my case, and it doesn't help sort of Kevin Randall's case or any of the other researchers, of the possibility that the material evidence is buried so deeply that no matter how much good testimony comes along, we cannot access the facts and the hard evidence. And I think for that reason, that's why you don't see, the fallouts where Kevin Randall puts a book out and then, then the Men in Black are knocking on his door the next day. There's no need for them to do that, because they know that, like me, Kevin can't access the bodies or the debris. So, and if some action was taken, then it would make people sit up and say, well, hang on, if he's been threatened, then he's got to be on the right track. So the best thing is just to do nothing and say nothing,
Quite possible.
Now,
so what was the rabbit hole question?
No,
that's what I was going. Yeah.
I didn't forget.
And take a step back and go. Oh,
and go. Okay. My question was going to be. And you've kind of already answered it, Nick, but I want to pose anyway. What are the odds that, first of all, your theory is correct, and what took place in Roswell was not a UFO crash, but it was our government experimenting, using unwanted, undesirable elements of our own society, of our own U.S. people, using them as guinea pigs? What would be the odds that once they covered it up and they were able to get away with it, that they would keep doing it throughout the decades that followed?
Well, I mean, I've got to be honest, I haven't seen any evidence from other crashed UFO cases that might be the case. I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book is how clearly in the early 50s onwards, a lot of crashed UFO cases were created by sort of intelligence agents and disinformation experts to essentially create more and more claims of crashed UFOs to further bury the Roswell affair. So there may not actually have been, any legitimate UFO crashes. but a lot of stories created to make it look like that. So in other words, I actually haven't seen evidence of sort of post-47, post-48 maybe, experiments like the Roswell one undertaken. And certainly all the old-timers I interviewed said that the program was pretty much completely shut down, sort of 47, 48, but research into the files from then and how far that they got did continue, but the flights and the experiments didn't happen. But I do talk in the book about the files of one particular program that have been released called Project Sunshine,
Yes.
which was a very strange program, which involved securing from hospitals and mortuaries the bodies of people and even newborn babies, and used in radiation experiments. And the Operation Sunshine files, they've been declassified into the public domain. They actually amount to part of the massive file collection that are contained in the President Clinton radiation experiment investigations of the early 90s. And you can read those files where they talk about one of the major players in Operation Sunshine asking the question, is there anyone who knows the laws about how to do a bit of body snatching on, where we can do these experiments? They actually say that in the files. Does anybody know the legal issues of doing a bit of body snatching? That's literally what the question was asked. And they're like,
Wow.
one guy said, well, I know we can get some certain body parts from a hospital in Formosa, and, there are hospitals here we can look into. So, there was that angle. But in terms of specific flights, of the kind that potentially happened at Roswell, I've actually not seen anything to suggest that went on after, the late 40s.
Mm-hmm. I was just curious. Like I say, it's a rabbit hole, because when you look at Roswell, and this has to be the case for you as a researcher, do you find Roswell to be one of the more frustrating things to research?
Well, it is. I mean, it's an interesting one, or a fascinating one to investigate, because there are so many threads, leads, so many first-hand witnesses, second-hand, third-hand, photographs, people who we know were at the site and are now gone. So in other words, it's fascinating and kind of exciting because it is such a big case with so many people, but it's frustrating that no one in the field can kind of get beyond that brick wall. And the brick wall is everything that isn't witness testimony, friend of a friend stories, my grandfather said this, etc. All that's really good material, but we need to, and I would encourage people, to still look for that kind of thing. But what we need now to take it to another level is the original files or the original photographs. If the official files ever surfaced, whether officially or through a mistake, they were released by mistake, or somebody had made copies years earlier, those pictures would potentially either show something that was like a handicapped person, or they would show a dead alien, and we would know for sure. So that's what we need to try and find. But the problem is, and a lot of people don't want to hear this, I just don't know how we get that hard evidence. I just don't. And I think the people who are hiding it know full well that we cannot get it. I mean, you think about it. If it was just a military experiment, it would be easy just to store all the original files, even if it was thousands and thousands of pages, in half a dozen filing cabinets in an underground bunker, which is guarded 24/7, 40 feet underground. You could never get that, ever.
Right.
And I think that's the problem. That's the frustrating, to get back to your point about frustration, that's the frustrating point about it. We can get so far, but then after getting so far, none of us can get beyond that point. And I think whoever's hiding this is quite happy and satisfied that they know we cannot get it. And so there is no fear factor that it could surface. That's the only thing I can think of as to why, nobody, like I said, Kevin Randall or Don Schmidt has, been pushed against a wall by some guy in a black suit saying, leave this alone or else. That hasn't happened. and it hasn't happened because there's safety in knowing that we can't get it.
Well, I think, and you made a very interesting statement. You said whoever did this is sitting back smiling. So obviously there's still a little bit of a conspiracy theorist in you that thinks there's somebody, the cigarette smoking man from the X-Files is back there smiling that people haven't found these documents.
Well,
but
the way I look at it is that some of the people I spoke to did say they heard or felt that the original files were destroyed. But then other people said, well, some of them may have been, others survived. Now, one of the people I spoke to for the book was an Australian well-respected researcher named Keith Basterfield. And Keith's story came out of Australia, and his source, he'd been told this story back in the 50s, but this came from British intelligence, as if the Brits had got files on Roswell. They'd actually sort of been spying on, what actually happened at Roswell as well, and put their own files together. So, in other words, even though I think there's a high likelihood that the official files are hidden away somewhere we cannot get them, I think there's probably some sort of program that continues to this day to monitor every aspect of, all the Roswell books as they come out and articles, etc., because there is maybe this fear that they didn't quite get all the files, you know what I mean? And not quite all the file could be anything from 50 pages to 10,000, we don't know. So I think there is this fear that perhaps 70 years later, maybe they don't even know if the guys back then got everything. There could have been a lot of crazy things going on and people running around different installations to scoop up all the papers and before, the secret really leaks out. So it's not impossible, I think, that this group do have their concerns as to whether or not, their equivalents 50 years, 60 years ago got everything. If they didn't, that possibly would explain some sort of clandestine, deeply buried program just to try and make sure that nothing ever does surface,
Well, on the flip side of that coin, though, don't you also think that pop culture is doing a great job of creating fake documents and fake media? I mean, you look back, you had the alien autopsy video that was leaked back in the 90s, and you have photographs that are being leaked. I mean, we've gotten to the point technologically where that anybody with the right software and some documents can, or a foundation of documents can create things that could mislead people.
Well, yeah, I mean, we live in a strange world today, like fake news, alternative facts, things like that,
Okay, now I was not trying to sound like President Trump. I was not talking about fake news and fake media.
No, but I mean, but you're right, though. It's difficult to know what the truth is and where the truth begins and the rumor starts and everything else. And also, I mean, you make a good point with things like the alien autopsy film. I mean, for a while, a number of ufologists were convinced, or fairly convinced, that this was the real thing. Because it actually was quite well done, really. It wasn't like a shoddy piece of work. It was well done. But what you didn't have, like Ray Santilli, the guy who released the film, nobody came running round to Santilli's house and slammed him against a wall or anything like that. Right. And now, if we did really have dead aliens, maybe that would have happened to him. But if somebody in the know realizes that there never really has been a dead alien or a crashed UFO, they would take the view, well, it's just, we may not know who made it, but it's a hoax because we know aliens haven't crashed. So in other words, you can sort of gauge the effect on the validity of the case by the blowback against the person who's revealing the story, or the lack of it, because the lack of it usually implies, well, we're not worried because there's no way anybody can get anything,
Now, looking at the theory that you put forth in the book and the lives that obviously were apparently were lost, if there were bodies that were discovered, these being either handicapped individuals, asylum patients, prisoners, whatever, the massive amounts of efforts that have been put forth to keep this buried. Did anything good come out of these experiments?
Well, I mean, that's debatable. I mean, well, it depends how you look at it. I mean, there's no doubt that the German scientists massively advanced the U.S. rocketry program, which led into the space program. It significantly, changed the face of rocketry in the 40s and 50s. But, it's like, well, should we have used them? That's the thing. So when you talk about did anything good come from it, certain good things did come from it. Like we got, developed the atomic bomb before,
Right.
The Russians. But when good things are done, sometimes bad things are done to achieve a greater good.
Good thing.
Right. And then people have discussed, with things like Operation Paperclip, is the level of, the badness that was undertaken, bringing these scientists over, is that justifiable by the positive things that came out of it? And you can understand why some people would take one approach, no, we shouldn't have done a deal with Nazis, but then you have other people taking the other approach, like we mentioned earlier, well, if we hadn't done it, the Russians would have got it. So,
Right.
I guess there's always going to be this two sides of the coin where people are going to say, well, okay, maybe there was some good came from it, but did we really have to go through all that to achieve a bit of something positive, And I guess, that's a thing that there'll never be like a conclusive answer on, because everybody has different opinions,
Well, I guess it does boil down to something we said earlier. It's very easy for us in 2017 to sit in judgment of 1947. A very different world at that time. A very different world.
Yeah, and I mean, and it was, we just fought a war with the Nazis, these deranged master race, as they call themselves, who actually did come close to winning. A lot of people don't realize that there was at one point when the Germans were, it was like, oh no, we're actually on the losing side now. And fortunately, that didn't happen. We were lucky. But in saying that, that when you look back at that period, we just got over that. Then we're potentially going to face off with the Russians. And you can see how somebody would have said, look, we just got to, whatever we've got to do, just follow every angle to give us, leverage above the Russians. Just do what's got to be done. Because if not, our country's going to be wiped out if they develop, substantial technology beyond ours, which would have happened. I have no doubt at all in the early years that had, there been a face-off, then it would have probably gone to war. It doesn't happen today because everybody's so deathly frightened of the fact that each nation's got so many nukes that nobody can win. There's that realization that no one can win. But I think back in the early 50s, it was a case of, well, we may just have to go to war and do our best to, to beat them. So, in other words, the world was very different, and there was a great deal of fear of the Russians being the next big enemy, and so I can, I'm not endorsing it, but I can understand why people may have said behind the scenes, just do what's got to be done to achieve what we need to do to ensure our safety,
Well, and I think,
that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think, in the end, that's we as citizens expect our government to do what is in our best interest. We just often don't think that they may make decisions that we find questionable sometimes. And I think looking at what you have presented, it has been a very, very solid approach to this particular event that took place. And I told Wendy earlier, I have been interested in Roswell since the early 1990s. This is the first time that I've ever looked at it and said, okay, something else may have happened than what I believe has happened.
Well, he was devastated.
I was devastated. I was.
Yep.
Well, I mean, the big irony is people have asked me, how do you feel about it? People ask me, how do I feel about it? Well, the big irony is that I still hope, even though I don't think aliens crashed at Roswell, if you ask me, do I think it would be the greatest thing for ufology if it was found that aliens did crash? Well, yes, it would, because it would vindicate all the research we've done. Mm-hmm. So, in other words, even I would actually love it if it was proved to be extraterrestrial. But I just don't think anymore that it was extraterrestrial. But I mean, one of the things we haven't sort of touched on, which I think is an important one, is the fact that when Body Snatchers came out, I just told this back in 2005. I just told the story of what happened. But in the new book, I talk about how the response of the UFO community to the book, and I talk about how people said it was Nick Redfern's theory, Nick Redfern's idea. But in the new book, I pointed out how actually a lot of people have been given this story over the years but did nothing with it. Keith Basterfield, the Australian researcher I mentioned, he was given the same story, practically identical to the one given to me, but that was actually given to him by a British source long before Body Snatchers itself was published, which is in 2005. And in 1997, Popular Mechanics magazine, which is a well-respected magazine, they said that they'd been told of a forthcoming release of a Japanese equivalent of paperclip. Files would be released, which would show what really happened at Roswell. And the late Leonard Stringfield, who investigated a lot of crashed UFO stories, he published in 1991 the same story, but with one variation, where he talked about some of these Japanese people using these experiments brought over not just to the military installations like White Sands and so on, but also to Los Alamos, where the atomic bomb was developed, and were involved in some experiments there. And some of these people were reportedly handicapped people brought over from Japan and used in these experiments. And Stringfield published that story in 91. That's like, that's pushing 30 years ago now.
Yeah, very close.
And so, in other words, the story has had long legs and a long history, so to speak, but very few people in ufology have wanted to touch it, I think, for fear of, what are people going to say? Am I going to be thrown off the lecture circuit and all this business? Well, for me, that's no reason not to put a story out. I mean, I put out what I find, and if people like it or don't like it, and if somebody don't want me to speak at their lectures ever again because I've, destroyed their belief system, well, that's, I'm not going to lose sleep. I don't write books to, try and, elevate myself. I put books out because I think it's important to share the data. And so I don't care about things like, oh, we're not going to book you to speak again because you've spoiled all our fun.
Well, I was going to ask you: is this going to affect you being invited back to the Roswell event every year?
Well, I'm actually speaking there this year, next month. Actually, at the end of this month, I should say, through the start of July. I'm speaking at the UFO Festival, which is put on every year by Guy Malone. There are actually two festivals every year, but Guy puts one on. And I spoke at the 2006 event on Body Snatchers, and I'll be speaking on the new one at this forthcoming conference. And to his credit, Guy's like, yeah, I want you to speak about it because we're all looking for answers for Roswell. He was upfront and honest enough to admit that. He wants the answers. He doesn't just want to uphold a theory because it brings people into town, And I often wonder if it was proved to be some dark and dubious experiment, what effect would that actually have on the people of Roswell and the festivals and the celebrations every year? I could see all that just coming to a shuddering halt. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know.
Yep.
I actually think that would happen. It would be like overnight. It would be, we can't really celebrate this anymore. You know what I mean?
Yeah. You're getting ready to. You are going to. Yeah. Nick Redfern single-handedly destroys tourism for Roswell, New Mexico.
No, that
one
is kind
fell
of an
swoop.
interesting angle, but I mean, it's.
But
But again, what it comes just down to this one thing, though, that unless the hard evidence ever surfaces, it won't matter, because people will continue to believe whatever they want to believe until they see that hard evidence. Yeah.
They will still question, and they will still research, and they will still look for answers for themselves. And in the grand scheme of things, and in the long run, isn't that what you set out to do, and what we set out to do by having these shows, is to have people question and ask questions and to seek the truth?
Yeah, because, I mean, I always tell people that the U in UFO still stands for unidentified. We don't really know what the real UFO phenomenon is. There's no doubt in my mind there's a real phenomenon. Like I said, I'm just not sure an aspect of that phenomenon came down at Roswell. But there is a UFO phenomenon. But we don't know what it is. We're still struggling to find the answers. And so for that some UFOs I'm sure are sort of like classified military programs. Mm-hmm. Others I'm sure are something from somewhere else, which had nothing to do with us. And things like alien abductions. Ironically, I'm a believer in alien abductions, but I'm not a believer that aliens crashed at Roswell. So, in other words, ufology will still exist, or should still exist, regardless of what Roswell turns out to be or turns out not to be. But, like I said, what we need to do is to take a deep breath and realize that not everything stands or falls on Roswell. In fact, nothing should stand or fall on Roswell, because there's so many good, solid cases where you can make a case.
Right. So we're coming to the bottom, the bottom of our hour, top of the next hour. What are you working on now, Nick? What can folks expect? The next great. Well, I'm Redferning again. I'm Redferning again. What's the next great book?
Well, I've got one book coming out in September, which is called. It's like a totally different book. It's on my other big interest of cryptozoology. It's called Shapeshifters, and it's like a study of throughout history, folklore, mythology, legends, stories of creatures that could shapeshift. Everybody thinks of werewolves, but you've got ones like skinwalkers. You have excuse me. You have things like in Africa, you have these ancient leopard cults where people believe they could transform themselves into leopards. So it's like a study, like a cultural history around the world of magical shape-shifting creatures. And then in February of next year, I've got a full-length book coming out on the whole Slender Man controversy.
Excellent.
How the Slender Man thing began as like a meme on the internet, and then how people now claim to see the Slender Man in the real world. So the book covers areas like, the idea that the human mind, intense concentration, can kind of create like a real life version of something that actually began as fiction. It deals with things like, which are known as like thought forms. The idea that the thousands of people concentrating on a particular image, like the Slender Man, that they can inadvertently create like a supernatural equivalent of the Slender Man, but in the real world. And then, of course, it's like when the door's been opened, it's hard to shut it again. It deals with like a Tibetan Buddhist concept known as the tulpa.
The tulpa. Yes, I was going
to ask.
Yeah, so I talk about that quite a lot in the book, and whether or not the internet is becoming sort of self-aware and could potentially have an impact on the reality of the Slender Man as well.
So we definitely can we go ahead and start trying to book you for either August or September when the book comes out?
Yeah, the book will be at any time. I know they don't like me to sort of really do big interviews before they come out. But yeah, the book's out around about September the 3rd or 4th. So yeah, anytime around then we can do it. So yeah.
Okay. Now are you? Yes. Any potential that you're going back to the Mothman Festival in Point Pleasant in September?
Unfortunately, I won't be this year. No.
Okay.
I've actually got a prior event that was already booked. So, but I'd like to go back. I mean, last year's was a good one because it was sort of the first part of the 50th anniversary, and this year's going to be So the second part of the 50th anniversary.
So, yes, this is the 50th anniversary of the bridge collapse in December.
Yeah, that's right. But
Okay.
I mean, I like the idea of the way they do it. I mean, conferences are good, but the idea where it's like almost like it's like a huge county fair kind of thing,
It is.
I like that.
It
I
is.
like that approach where you can buy, moth burgers and,
Did you have the Mothman burger?
Kids can have Yeah, it tasted just like a normal burger, unfortunately.
Except now it shouldn't have. It should have been stacked with jalapeno peppers. It should have been in the burger. Yeah. There should have been jalapeno peppers, and it should have had pepper jack cheese and jalapenos on it. I've had the real Mothman burger.
I actually said to one of the guys who was selling them, I said, shouldn't it contain like feathers or something like that? But no, I mean, it's like they've got things. For people who are listening who haven't been there, you've got things like the Miss Mothman pageant for the kids, and yes. They've got bands playing, and then they've got lectures, obviously, but and then there's people selling artwork of Mothman and fridge magnets and
everything. And the Mothman Festival, you can go watch all the movies, documentaries, TV shows, movies. I spoke, probably 4 or 5 years I spoke up there.
Cool.
On Mothman. I always did. I closed out the event on Sundays talking about the religious angle of the Mothman sightings.
Cool.
Yeah.
The only downside with the Mothman Festival is there's so much good stuff for sale. If you're not careful, you could end up coming back broke.
You can. You really
you have to put a
can.
limit on it. I'm like, oh my God, I've got to get that. I'm like, oh well, do I get it or not?
Yeah, it's like books, movies, T-shirts.
Yes.
But
it is a really good vibe and everything.
It is. It's very positive. That's one of the things I did like about it. It's a huge turnout. You got a town of about 5,000 people, and it jumps to about 15,000 for that weekend because they have about 10,000 people that come in over the course of the weekend from all over the world. You meet people from Japan, China, UK, Ireland, Australia. It's just amazing the people that come there. But,
I was hoping actually somebody would have put out like a 50th anniversary book, sort of a full overview of everything we know,
Yeah, and no one has.
No, it's a shame. I was hoping somebody was going to do that.
Well, aren't the Daves doing the Mothman Files?
The Mothman Files documentary film.
Point Pleasant Files,
yes. Point Pleasant Files, which we've got them on the show. Well, they were supposed to be on Sunday. We're trying to reschedule them. I actually have been working on
DVD or something, is it?
It is.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. I actually have been working on a book, but I just don't have the time to finish it. So, on all of my research that had gone into the Mothman.
Oh, cool.
But anyway, Nick, thank you so much. It is always it's a pleasure and an honor. I love having you on the show. Love talking with you.
Well, thanks a lot, guys. I had a good time. I think we covered a lot of ground as well in
I think so.
2 hours or thereabouts. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Didn't want to give away too much of the book because we want people to buy it. How can they buy it, by the way? And we'll do that, and then we'll round it.
Okay. Well, the book's called The Roswell UFO Conspiracy, and it's just been out about close to a month now. And you can buy it off Amazon. And you can, or if you want to go into your local Barnes and Noble, they can get it overnight for you. They can order it, and it'll come through in about sort of 3 days, something like that. So, but any sort of online place as well, you should be able to get it.
Well,
thank you so much.
While we're here talking about it, I had one question or one just that I don't know. It just kind of bugged me a little bit about the early Fugo. Was it Fugo, the balloons that came in, and were dropping the bubonic plague on people in New Mexico? What is it about New Mexico? How did balloons get that far in? Even wow.
Well, I mean, this is one of the interesting things about these balloons is that they were calibrated to come down on the United States. Now, a lot of it was dependent on the wind and the jet stream and things like that. Now, some of them actually, there were rumors that some of these Fugo balloons actually reached like some of the East Coast states and were actually found in woods there. And, it was all hidden because of, like I said, the fear that it would affect morale if the realization that in some degree, that the Japanese had reached the U.S. So that's why it was hidden. But I mean, there are some stories of them being found in like Nebraska, for example, all over the place. And there was even stories about one or two being found in Canada. But, as I said, the fortunate thing was that they actually, it was more like a psychological weapon, and the media agreed with the FBI. The FBI said, can we just keep this under wraps a bit and not talk about it for fear of creating hysteria? And they agreed. So there wasn't that much newspaper coverage given. But if you look up Fugo balloon, F-U-G-O, you'll find a lot of the photographs, some of the photographs of them actually photographed by, U.S. militaries. They were approaching the U.S. coastline. And but there were some fatalities. It was like a group that actually found one of these balloons in the woods and tugged on it, wondering what it was, and they were killed, and others were very badly injured. But that was the only occasion. Otherwise, the bombs didn't go off, or they just plummeted into the Pacific. Were never seen again. So.
Right. Yeah. Thankfully, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
thankfully.
that was my kind of my question there. I kept going, wow, they made it in that far. Seriously.
Oh yeah, but a lot of it, as I said, they sort of went in the jet stream across the Pacific, but there was no way to actually. They couldn't be steered. They were just balloons that were just being carried by the winds. But the hope was that because America is such a massive country, that they hoped that some of them would at least reach the target. So.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
All right. No problem at all.
Yep.
All right.
Well, as always, thank you so much, Nick. We will have you back on in September sometime to talk about the shapeshifters.
All right, that sounds great, guys. Thanks a lot.
Looking forward to it, and we will be in touch. Thank you so much.
All right, I'll talk to you later.
Okay, have a great evening.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Well,
All
Wendy,
right.
that wraps up another great episode of Mystic Moon Cafe and another great interview with Nick Redfern.
Yes, it does.
Yes, I was Redferning. No, that's okay. I think we can just go ahead and do the close. Don't you, Wendy?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, just go ahead and do the close.
And we're talking to everybody. Good night, everybody. We'll see you probably next week.
Next Wednesday. Bye.
Thank you for joining us tonight. You've been listening to Mystic Moon Cafe. Join us every Wednesday from 9 to 11 p.m. Eastern. Be sure to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. On behalf of Wendy Schindler, this is Travis Short saying have a great rest of your week.